The morning Catherine Williams stepped into Kensington Palace for what she believed would be a routine photography assignment, she had no idea that a single moment would transform her from an unknown freelance photographer into the center of the most talked-about royal story of the decade. It started with a misdelivered envelope, a wrong turn down a restricted corridor, and a conversation she was never meant to hear. Within hours, Catherine would become the keeper of a secret so significant that palace officials would spend the next 3 weeks deciding whether to confirm what she had accidentally discovered or to let the speculation consume the monarchy itself. This is the true story of how an ordinary woman's extraordinary encounter with royal protocol would lead to the most anticipated palace announcement in years, leaving millions of royal watchers around the world holding their breath for what palace insiders are calling the big reveal that will reshape how we see the modern monarchy forever. The truth, as Catherine would soon learn, was far more incredible than any royal correspondent could have imagined. Catherine Williams had always believed that the most exciting thing about her Tuesday mornings was choosing between Earl Grey or English breakfast tea. As a freelance photographer specializing in corporate events and small weddings, her life followed a predictable rhythm that rarely deviated from the ordinary. She lived in a modest flat in Camden, drove a 10-year-old Honda that made concerning noises when turning left, and had a savings account that would make her financial advisor weep if she actually had one. That Tuesday in late September started like any other. Her alarm buzzed at 6:30, she cursed the London weather through her rain-spotted window, and checked her phone for the day's assignment details. The message from her agency was brief but intriguing: emergency booking, Kensington Palace, corporate photography, contact Margaret Thornley upon arrival, payment triple standard rate. Catherine read the message 3 times. Kensington Palace was not the kind of venue that typically appeared in her calendar. Her usual assignments involved photographing ribbon-cutting ceremonies for local businesses or capturing the forced smiles of office workers at company parties. The triple payment rate was enough to cover her rent for 2 months, which meant she couldn't afford to question the opportunity too deeply. After a quick shower and a piece of toast that she ate while walking to the tube station, Catherine found herself standing outside the imposing gates of Kensington Palace by 9:15. The September air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant hum of London traffic. She clutched her camera bag tighter as she approached the security checkpoint, feeling underdressed in her practical black trousers and navy blazer. The security guard, a stern-faced man in his 50s with eyes that suggested he had seen every possible attempt at unauthorized palace entry, examined her credentials with the thoroughness of someone checking state secrets. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 minutes, he directed her to a side entrance she had never noticed during her occasional tourist walks through the area. Margaret Thornley turned out to be a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of posture that suggested decades of dealing with royal protocol. She met Catherine at the side entrance with a warm but professional smile and a clipboard that appeared to contain enough paperwork to document a small country's constitution. "Miss Williams," Margaret said, extending a firm handshake, "thank you for coming at such short notice." "I understand your agency explained that this is a corporate photography assignment?" Catherine nodded, though she was beginning to suspect that corporate might be a generous interpretation of whatever was about to unfold. Margaret led her through a series of corridors that seemed to exist in a different century from the London streets just outside. The walls were adorned with portraits of people who looked as though they had never experienced a moment of uncertainty in their lives, and the carpet beneath their feet was so thick that Catherine's footsteps were completely silent. "The situation," Margaret explained as they walked, "is somewhat delicate. We're documenting a series of private meetings that will be part of a larger announcement in the coming weeks. The participants prefer to remain anonymous for now, but I can tell you that the meetings concern matters of significant public interest." They stopped outside a set of double doors that looked as though they had been designed to intimidate anyone who might consider entering without permission. Margaret paused with her hand on the ornate brass handle and turned to Catherine with an expression that was equal parts warning and reassurance. "Miss Williams, I need to stress the importance of discretion regarding anything you might see or hear during your time here today. You'll be asked to sign a confidentiality agreement before you begin, and I want to ensure you understand the seriousness of that commitment." Catherine nodded again, though her curiosity was now competing seriously with her nervousness. She had photographed enough corporate events to know that requests for confidentiality usually meant either someone very important was involved, or someone was about to be in serious trouble. In this setting, she suspected it might be both. Margaret opened the doors to reveal a room that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed furniture should double as art installations. Everything was either gilded, upholstered in silk, or positioned at angles that suggested mathematical precision. Large windows overlooked the palace gardens, where autumn flowers created patches of color that seemed almost too perfect to be real. 3 people were seated around a mahogany table that could have comfortably accommodated 12. Catherine recognized none of them, though something about their bearing suggested they were accustomed to rooms exactly like this one. 2 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 40s or 50s, all dressed in the kind of understated expensive clothing that whispered rather than shouted about its cost. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret announced, "this is Catherine Williams, our photographer for this morning's session. Catherine, may I present Sir James Hartwell, Dr. Elizabeth Conway, and Mr. Philip Morrison." The introductions were accompanied by polite nods and the kind of handshakes that managed to convey both friendliness and the subtle reminder that this was not a social occasion. Sir James was tall and angular with the kind of silver hair that suggested distinguished service in something important but unspecified. Dr. Conway had intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room she entered. Mr. Morrison was shorter and rounder, with the slightly harried expression of someone perpetually managing details that others preferred not to think about. Catherine began setting up her equipment, grateful for the familiar routine of adjusting lights and checking camera settings. Photography had always been her refuge when social situations became overwhelming, and this particular situation felt overwhelming enough to require several refuges. As she worked, she caught fragments of conversation that suggested the 3 were discussing timelines, public reactions, and something referred to only as the announcement. Margaret had positioned herself near the windows, occasionally checking her watch with the precision of someone coordinating an operation that had multiple moving parts. Every few minutes, her phone would vibrate, and she would step into the corridor to take calls that Catherine could hear but not understand, involving phrases like confirmed schedule and media preparation. The photography session itself was surprisingly straightforward. The 3 participants were experienced at being photographed, moving naturally into positions that suggested collaboration and serious purpose without looking staged. Catherine found herself relaxing into the work, focusing on capturing expressions that conveyed both authority and approachability. It was during a brief break, while she was changing memory cards and the 3 were reviewing documents at the far end of the room, that Catherine made her first mistake of the day. Margaret had stepped out to take another phone call, and Catherine decided to visit the restroom she had noticed down the corridor. What she hadn't noticed was that there were 2 corridors leading from the room, and she chose the wrong one. The corridor she entered was similar to the one she had arrived through, but quieter and somehow more formal. The portraits on these walls depicted people in military uniforms and formal court dress, and the carpet was even thicker than what she had walked on earlier. Catherine was beginning to realize her error when she heard voices coming from a partially open door ahead of her. The voices were discussing schedules and logistics, which might have been unremarkable except for one detail that made Catherine stop walking entirely. One of the voices belonged to someone she recognized, though she couldn't immediately place where she had heard it before. It was a woman's voice, cultured and confident, speaking with the kind of authority that suggested she was accustomed to being listened to without question. "The timeline needs to be moved up," the voice was saying. "The speculation has reached a point where silence is becoming more damaging than disclosure would be." Catherine found herself frozen in the corridor, knowing she should turn around and return to where she belonged, but unable to move as the conversation continued. The second voice, male and equally authoritative, responded with obvious concern. "Moving up the timeline means less preparation time for media management. Are we certain that's wise?" "The decision has been made at the highest level," the woman's voice replied. "The announcement will be made next week, regardless of our preparation status. The public deserves to know, and the delay has already been longer than anyone anticipated." Catherine finally managed to convince her feet to start moving again, but as she turned to retrace her steps, she heard something that made her stop once more. The woman's voice had shifted to discussing specific details about the announcement, and Catherine realized why the voice sounded familiar. She had heard it countless times on television and radio, during state occasions and public appearances. The voice belonged to someone whose statements routinely became international headlines, whose decisions affected millions of people, and whose presence at a private meeting in Kensington Palace could only mean that whatever announcement was being planned was far more significant than Catherine had imagined. As she finally managed to walk back toward the room where her photography assignment was waiting, Catherine's mind was racing with implications she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. The corporate photography assignment was beginning to seem like a very thin cover for something much more important, and she was starting to suspect that she had stumbled into a situation that was far beyond anything her experience had prepared her to handle. When she returned to the original room, Margaret was back at her post by the windows, and the three participants were ready to resume the photography session. No one seemed to have noticed her absence, but Catherine felt as though she was now carrying information that changed everything about why she was there. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of professional competence masking internal confusion. Catherine completed her assignment, packed her equipment, and accepted Margaret's thanks and the promise that payment would be processed within 24 hours. She signed the confidentiality agreement without reading it as carefully as she should have, her mind still processing what she had overheard in the wrong corridor. It wasn't until she was back on the tube, heading toward her flat with her camera bag and a head full of questions, that Catherine began to understand the real significance of her accidental discovery. The voice she had recognized, the authority behind the decision to move up the timeline, and the mention of an announcement that would be made regardless of preparation status suddenly clicked into place with a clarity that made her stomach lurch. Catherine Williams, freelance photographer and keeper of no secrets more significant than her landlord's tendency to ignore repair requests, had accidentally become privy to advance knowledge of a royal announcement that was apparently significant enough to require careful media management and timeline adjustments at the highest levels of the monarchy. As her train pulled into Camden Station, Catherine realized that her ordinary Tuesday had become the beginning of something that would make her question everything she thought she knew about coincidence, responsibility, and what happens when ordinary people stumble into extraordinary situations completely by accident. Catherine spent the rest of Tuesday afternoon sitting in her small kitchen, staring at her camera and trying to convince herself that she had misunderstood what she had overheard in the palace corridor. She made 3 cups of tea and drank none of them, reorganized her photography equipment twice, and found herself checking news websites every 10 minutes for any mention of pending royal announcements. By Wednesday morning, her rational mind had almost succeeded in dismissing the entire experience as a misinterpretation of an overheard conversation between palace staff discussing routine administrative matters. Almost. The problem was that rational explanations had a way of crumbling when she remembered the unmistakable authority in that familiar voice, and the specific words about timelines being moved up at the highest level. Catherine was editing photos from a wedding she had shot the previous weekend when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and she almost sent it to voicemail before recognizing the area code as Central London. "Miss Williams? This is Margaret Thornley. We met yesterday at Kensington Palace." Catherine's stomach performed what felt like a complete somersault. "Yes, of course. Hello, Margaret. I hope I'm not disturbing your work, but I have a rather unusual request. Would you be available for another assignment this Friday?" Similar circumstances to yesterday, though perhaps a bit more involved. Catherine found herself agreeing before her brain had fully processed the implications. Margaret's tone was friendly but carried an undercurrent that suggested this was less of a request and more of a carefully worded expectation. They arranged for Catherine to arrive at the same side entrance at 9 o'clock Friday morning, with the same equipment and the same understanding about discretion. After hanging up, Catherine sat staring at her phone for several minutes. 2 palace assignments in 1 week was unusual enough, but the timing felt significant in a way that made her increasingly uncomfortable. She spent the rest of Wednesday alternating between excitement about the additional income and growing anxiety about whatever she might have stumbled into. Thursday brought an unexpected complication in the form of her friend Sarah, who worked as a junior reporter for a London lifestyle magazine. Sarah had developed an uncanny ability to detect when Catherine was hiding something interesting, a skill that had proven problematic during various dating disasters and financial emergencies over the years. "You look like someone who's been keeping secrets," Sarah announced, appearing at Catherine's door Thursday evening with a bottle of wine and the determined expression of someone who had no intention of leaving until she had extracted whatever information she was seeking. Catherine had learned that the most effective way to handle Sarah's investigative instincts was to provide just enough truth to satisfy her curiosity without revealing anything genuinely sensitive. Unfortunately, this strategy became significantly more challenging when the sensitive information involved royal protocols and overheard conversations in palace corridors. "I've been doing some corporate photography," Catherine said, which was technically accurate while being completely misleading about the nature of the corporations involved. Sarah poured herself a generous glass of wine and settled into Catherine's small sofa with the patience of someone prepared to wait for better information. "Corporate photography doesn't usually make you look like you're harboring state secrets." "What kind of corporations?" Catherine mumbled something about confidentiality agreements and changed the subject to Sarah's latest romantic disaster, which provided enough conversational material to last through the rest of the bottle of wine. Sarah left around 10 o'clock, apparently satisfied that Catherine's secretive behavior was related to work stress rather than anything genuinely newsworthy. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzling, which seemed appropriate for Catherine's increasingly complicated relationship with whatever was happening at Kensington Palace. She arrived at the side entrance precisely at 9 o'clock, where Margaret was waiting with the same professional smile and an additional clipboard that suggested today's assignment would be more complex than Tuesday's session. "Miss Williams," Margaret said as they walked through the now familiar corridors, "today's session will involve documenting a larger meeting. There will be approximately 12 participants, and the photography requirements will be more extensive." They entered a different room this time, larger and more formal than the previous location. The furniture was arranged to accommodate a proper conference, with a long table surrounded by chairs that looked like they had been designed to make important decisions. Large windows overlooked a different section of the palace gardens, where maintenance workers were tending to flower beds with the kind of precision that suggested royal scrutiny. Catherine began setting up her equipment, noting that the lighting requirements would be more challenging due to the room's size and the formal seating arrangement. As she worked, people began arriving in small groups, their conversations quiet but intense. She recognized Sir James, Dr. Conway, and Mr. Morrison from Tuesday's session, but the other participants were new to her. What struck Catherine immediately was the diversity of the group. There were people who clearly belonged in palace settings, wearing the kind of understated formal wear that suggested familiarity with royal protocols. But there were also people who looked like they had been pulled from university lectures, community organizations, and professional associations. It was an unusual mix that suggested whatever was being planned would affect multiple segments of society. Margaret introduced Catherine to the group as their photographer for the session, and then took her position near the windows with the same clipboard coordination she had demonstrated earlier in the week. The meeting began with introductions that revealed titles and affiliations Catherine hadn't expected: professors of constitutional law, representatives from various charitable organizations, experts in public communications, and several people whose introductions included phrases like advisor to and consultant for without specifying exactly who they advised or consulted for. The photography session was more complex than Tuesday's assignment, requiring Catherine to move around the room to capture different group configurations and discussion dynamics. As she worked, she found herself overhearing fragments of conversation that made her increasingly certain that she was documenting something far more significant than routine corporate meetings. The discussions involved timelines, public education campaigns, constitutional precedents, and something referred to repeatedly as the transition process. There were references to historical examples, international comparisons, and the need for careful public preparation. Most concerning from Catherine's perspective were the frequent mentions of media strategy and the importance of controlling information released to prevent speculation and misinformation. It was during a break in the formal session, while participants were reviewing documents and Catherine was changing equipment settings, that she overheard a conversation that made everything click into place with uncomfortable clarity. Two of the constitutional law professors were discussing the legal implications of what they referred to as the succession announcement, and one mentioned that the timing had been moved up specifically because continued speculation was becoming counterproductive. The other professor expressed concern about public readiness, but noted that the decision has been made at the very highest level, and our job is to ensure the implementation is as smooth as possible. Catherine nearly dropped her camera. The succession announcement. The phrases she had been hearing all morning suddenly reorganized themselves into a coherent and startling picture. the diverse expertise in the room, the references to constitutional precedents and public education campaigns, the careful coordination of timelines and media strategy all pointed to one conclusion that made her hands shake slightly as she adjusted her camera settings. She was documenting planning sessions for a royal succession announcement. Someone in the direct line of inheritance was preparing to make a change that would affect the monarchy itself, and she had accidentally become a witness to the advance planning for what would undoubtedly become international news. The rest of the session passed in a haze of professional competence masking internal turmoil. Catherine completed her photography requirements, capturing the serious discussions and collaborative planning that she now understood were laying groundwork for a historic announcement. When Margaret thanked her for her work and mentioned that there might be additional assignments in the coming weeks, Catherine managed to respond appropriately while her mind was racing with implications she wasn't sure she wanted to fully understand. The journey back to her flat felt surreal. Catherine found herself looking at fellow tube passengers and wondering how they would react when whatever announcement was being planned became public knowledge. She thought about Sarah's investigative instincts and realized that keeping this secret was going to become increasingly difficult as the announcement date approached. Friday evening found Catherine sitting in her kitchen again, but this time she was facing a different kind of uncertainty. She was no longer questioning whether she had stumbled into something significant. The question now was what responsibility, if any, she had regarding the information she had accidentally acquired. The confidentiality agreement she had signed was clear about her legal obligations, but it said nothing about the ethical dimensions of her situation. She had advanced knowledge of what appeared to be a major royal announcement, obtained completely by accident during the course of legitimate work assignments. The knowledge made her feel like she was carrying around a secret that belonged to the entire country, not to one freelance photographer who had taken the wrong turn in a palace corridor. Saturday morning brought another phone call from Margaret Thornley, this one requesting Catherine's availability for what was described as documentation of the final planning session the following Tuesday. Margaret's tone carried an additional note of urgency, and she mentioned that this would likely be Catherine's final assignment related to the current project. After agreeing to Tuesday's session, Catherine spent the weekend trying to return to her normal routine. She edited photos from recent assignments, paid bills, and attempted to grocery shop without constantly checking news websites for any mention of royal announcements. The attempt was only partially successful. Sunday evening brought an unexpected development in the form of a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Miss Williams, this is Dr. Elizabeth Conway. I hope you don't mind that Margaret provided your contact information. I was impressed by your professionalism during our sessions this week, and I wanted to discuss a potential opportunity with you. Would you be available for a brief conversation Monday morning?" Catherine stared at the message for several minutes before responding that she would be available. Dr. Conway had been one of the more enigmatic participants in the sessions, someone whose expertise and authority were obvious but whose specific role in the proceedings remained unclear. Catherine wasn't sure whether this additional contact was a positive development or a sign that her accidental knowledge was becoming a concern for the people planning whatever announcement was approaching. Monday morning's conversation with Dr. Conway took place in a small cafe near Russell Square, chosen apparently because it was public enough to seem casual but quiet enough for private conversation. Dr. Conway arrived precisely on time, wearing the same wire-rimmed glasses and confident expression Catherine remembered from the palace sessions. "Miss Williams," Dr. Conway began after they had ordered coffee, "I wanted to speak with you about your work with us this week. Margaret has mentioned that you've been exceptionally professional and discreet." Catherine nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading but increasingly certain that it was moving beyond simple professional courtesy. "The project you've been documenting is, as you've probably gathered, quite significant. The announcement we're preparing for will have considerable public impact, and we want to ensure that when it's made, it's done in a way that serves the public interest appropriately. Dr. Conway paused to sip her coffee, studying Catherine's expression with the attention of someone accustomed to reading people's reactions for important information. "We're aware that your work has necessarily given you advanced knowledge of sensitive information. That places you in a unique position, and we want to discuss how that position might be managed in everyone's best interest." Catherine felt her stomach tighten. The conversation was clearly moving towards something that would complicate her life significantly, and she wasn't sure she was prepared for whatever Dr. Conway was about to propose. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Catherine said, trying to keep her voice steady. Dr. Conway smiled, but it was the kind of smile that suggested she was about to make an offer that wasn't really optional. "We'd like you to become part of the announcement team." Catherine stared at Dr. Conway across the small cafe table, certain that she had misheard the proposal. The background noise of coffee machines and morning conversation seemed to fade as she tried to process what being part of an announcement team might actually mean. "I'm not sure I understand," Catherine said carefully. "I'm a photographer. I take pictures of corporate events and weddings. I don't know anything about royal announcements or media management." Dr. Conway's expression remained patient but determined. "That's precisely why you're valuable to us. You're outside the usual royal media apparatus, which means you bring a perspective that isn't constrained by traditional protocols. More importantly, you've already been exposed to sensitive information, which means we need to decide how to manage that exposure constructively." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. "Are you saying I don't have a choice about this?" "You always have choices, Miss Williams. But some choices have consequences that extend beyond personal preference. You've become aware of information that will affect millions of people when it's announced. We can either work together to ensure that announcement serves the public interest, or we can leave you to manage that knowledge independently while we proceed without your input." The implied threat was polite but unmistakable. Catherine was being offered the opportunity to become part of the solution, with the clear understanding that refusing might make her part of the problem. She thought about the confidentiality agreement she had signed, and realized that Dr. Conway was essentially offering her a way to transform her accidental knowledge from a liability into an asset. "What exactly would being part of the announcement team involve?" Catherine asked. Dr. Conway opened a leather portfolio she had brought to the meeting and pulled out a document that looked significantly more detailed than anything Catherine had encountered during her palace photography assignments. "The announcement will be made next Friday," Dr. Conway said, her voice dropping to a level that required Catherine to lean forward to hear clearly. "It will involve a fundamental change to the line of succession, announced jointly by the palace and the government. The change has been under consideration for some time, but recent circumstances have accelerated the timeline." Catherine felt her hands tremble slightly as she accepted the document Dr. Conway offered. The cover page was marked with official seals and the words "Confidential Media Strategy Overview" in red text. "The person making the announcement," Dr. Conway continued, "has decided to step aside from their position in the succession to pursue other forms of public service. It's an unprecedented decision in modern royal history, and it requires unprecedented planning to ensure public understanding and acceptance." Catherine's mind immediately went to the voice she had recognized in the palace corridor, the authority behind the decision to move up the timeline. The pieces of information she had been collecting over the past week suddenly assembled themselves into a picture that took her breath away. "They're abdicating," she said quietly. Dr. Conway nodded. "It's not being framed as an abdication in the traditional sense. The announcement will emphasize that this is a choice made to better serve the public interest, not a withdrawal from public responsibility." "But, yes, effectively, that's what's happening." Catherine looked around the cafe, noting the other customers going about their normal Monday morning routines, completely unaware that someone at a corner table was being briefed on information that would dominate international headlines within the week. The ordinary world suddenly felt very fragile. "Why me?" Catherine asked. "Why involve a photographer who happened to overhear something she shouldn't have heard?" Dr. Conway's expression softened slightly. "Because your accidental knowledge gives you a unique perspective. You understand how this information sounds to someone who isn't part of the royal establishment. That's invaluable when we're trying to craft an announcement that will be received constructively by the general public." She gestured to the document in Catherine's hands. "The media strategy we've developed is comprehensive, but it's been created entirely by people who live and work within royal protocols. We need someone who can help us understand how our approach will sound to ordinary citizens who don't have our institutional perspective." Catherine opened the document and immediately felt overwhelmed by its complexity. There were timeline charts, media contact lists, talking points for different types of interviews, and strategies for managing public reaction across various demographics. It was clearly the product of weeks or months of careful planning by people who understood media management at levels Catherine had never considered. "I don't know anything about this kind of work," Catherine said, looking up from the document. "That's exactly why we need you," Dr. Conway replied. "We need someone who can tell us when our explanations sound like palace bureaucracy instead of honest communication. Someone who can help us understand whether our approach actually addresses the questions ordinary people will have when this announcement is made." Catherine realized that she was being offered an opportunity that was simultaneously extraordinary and terrifying. The chance to influence how a historic royal announcement would be communicated to the public was the kind of experience that could transform her understanding of how major news was created and managed. It was also the kind of responsibility that could affect her life in ways she couldn't begin to predict. "What would I actually be doing?" she asked. Dr. Conway pulled out a second document, this one outlining what was described as citizen perspective integration in the announcement planning process. Catherine's role would involve reviewing draft announcements, media talking points, and public education materials to provide feedback on how they would be received by people outside the royal establishment. "Think of yourself as a translator," Dr. Conway explained. "We'll create content based on our understanding of royal protocols and constitutional requirements. Your job will be to tell us how that content sounds to someone who doesn't have our background, and to help us revise it to be more accessible and convincing." Catherine studied the document, noting that her involvement would begin immediately and continue through the announcement and its immediate aftermath. There were daily meetings scheduled, media strategy sessions, and something called post-announcement evaluation that suggested her role would extend well beyond Friday's announcement. "And if I say no?" Catherine asked. Dr. Conway's pause was brief but meaningful. "Then, you return to your normal life, bound by the confidentiality agreements you've already signed, while we proceed with our current strategy." "But, Catherine, may I call you Catherine? This announcement is going to happen regardless of your participation. The question is whether you want to help ensure it serves the public interest as effectively as possible." Catherine looked around the cafe again, trying to imagine returning to her normal routine of wedding photography and corporate events while knowing that she had declined the opportunity to influence how the public would learn about a historic royal decision. The idea of going back to ordinary life while carrying around the knowledge of what was coming felt almost impossible. "How much time do I have to decide?" she asked. "I need an answer today. If you agree, we start this afternoon with a briefing session that will bring you fully up to speed on the announcement details and strategy. If you decline, we need time to adjust our approach for the final week of preparation." Catherine realized that her decision would essentially be made based on instinct rather than careful consideration. She didn't have enough information to make a fully informed choice, and the timeline didn't allow for the kind of reflection she would normally want before committing to something this significant. But there was something about Dr. Conway's approach that suggested this was genuinely about serving public interest rather than managing potential problems. The offer felt like an opportunity to ensure that ordinary citizens would be considered in how extraordinary news was communicated, rather than an attempt to control or silence someone who had accidentally acquired sensitive information. "If I agree," Catherine said slowly, "what guarantees do I have that my input will actually be valued rather than just collected for appearance's sake?" Dr. Conway smiled, and this time the expression seemed entirely genuine. "You have my word that your perspective will be taken seriously. But, more than that, you'll see direct evidence of your influence in the final announcement materials. We're not looking for someone to rubber stamp our existing approach. We're looking for someone to help us improve it." Catherine took a deep breath and made her decision. "All right. I'll do it." Dr. Conway extended her hand across the table. "Welcome to the announcement team, Catherine. I think you're going to find this week more interesting than anything you've experienced in corporate photography." As they shook hands, Catherine realized that she had just committed to playing a role in communicating news that would affect not just the British monarchy, but the entire Commonwealth and beyond. Her quiet life as a freelance photographer had just become dramatically more complicated, and she wasn't sure whether to be excited or terrified by what the next week would bring. The afternoon briefing session took place in a small conference room in a building near Whitehall that Dr. Conway identified only as a government communications facility. Catherine found herself sitting around a table with 8 other people, including Margaret Thornley and several individuals she recognized from the palace photography sessions. The person leading the briefing was introduced as James Mitchell, Director of Strategic Communications, though for what organization was never specified. Mitchell was a thin man in his early 40s with the intense focus of someone accustomed to managing complex information under extreme time pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell began, "we are 6 days away from an announcement that will represent the most significant change to the monarchy in living memory. Our job is to ensure that when this announcement is made, the public receives clear, accurate information that promotes understanding and acceptance rather than confusion and speculation." Mitchell activated a large screen at the front of the room, displaying a timeline that began with final preparation week and ended with post-announcement monitoring. Catherine noted that her name appeared in several places on the timeline, associated with activities like public communication review and citizen response assessment. "The announcement," Mitchell continued, "will be made at 3 o'clock next Friday afternoon, simultaneously by the Palace and Downing Street. It will state that His Royal Highness has decided to renounce his place in the line of succession in order to pursue other forms of public service that he believes will better serve the national interest." Catherine felt a jolt of recognition. The voice she had overheard in the palace corridor belonged to someone whose decision would reshape the monarchy for generations. She was about to become part of communicating news that would affect constitutional arrangements that had been in place for centuries. Mitchell continued with details about media coordination, international notifications, and public education campaigns that would follow the announcement. The complexity was staggering, involving coordination across government departments, Commonwealth nations, and royal households in multiple countries. Catherine's specific role, as Mitchell explained it, would involve reviewing all public-facing materials to ensure they would be accessible and convincing to citizens who didn't have specialized knowledge of royal protocols or constitutional law. She would attend daily strategy meetings, provide feedback on draft statements, and help develop talking points for media interviews that would take place immediately after the announcement. "Miss Williams," Mitchell said, addressing her directly, "your perspective is crucial because you represent the intelligent, engaged citizen who will be trying to understand why this decision was made and what it means for the future. We need to know whether our explanations actually answer the questions people will have, or whether we're speaking in institutional language that doesn't translate to public understanding." As the briefing continued, Catherine began to understand the enormous scope of what was being planned. The announcement would be followed by a detailed explanation document, a series of media interviews, public education materials, and ongoing communication campaigns designed to maintain public confidence during what was acknowledged to be a period of constitutional uncertainty. By the time the briefing session ended at 6 o'clock, Catherine felt as though she had been inducted into a parallel world where ordinary news was carefully constructed by teams of specialists who thought about public reaction with scientific precision. The announcement that would surprise millions of people on Friday afternoon was the culmination of months of planning designed to minimize disruption and maximize understanding. Walking home through the London evening, Catherine realized that her accidental overhearing of a palace conversation had led to her becoming part of one of the most significant royal news management operations in modern history. She was no longer just someone who knew something she shouldn't know. She was now someone whose job was to help ensure that when the public learned what she knew, they would understand it in the way that best served everyone's interests. The responsibility felt enormous, and Catherine wasn't entirely sure she was qualified to carry it. But she was certain that the coming week would be unlike anything she had ever experienced, and that by the time Friday afternoon arrived, her understanding of how major news was created and communicated would be permanently changed. Tuesday morning found Catherine sitting in what had become her temporary office, a small room in the government communications facility equipped with a desk, a computer, and stacks of documents that represented different approaches to explaining constitutional changes to the general public. She had been at work since 7 o'clock, reviewing draft statements that would accompany Friday's announcement, and her notepad was already filled with observations about language that sounded clear to policy experts but would be confusing to anyone else. The first major challenge had emerged during Monday's strategy session when Catherine realized that much of the explanatory material was written in what she had started thinking of as constitutional academic speak. The documents were technically accurate and legally precise, but they assumed a level of knowledge about royal protocols that most citizens simply didn't have. When you say renouncing his place in the line of succession, Catherine had said during yesterday's review session, most people are going to wonder what that actually means for the monarchy. Does it mean someone else becomes king immediately? Does it mean the whole succession changes? You're assuming people understand how succession works, but I'm not sure they do. James Mitchell had looked up from his own notes with the expression of someone whose carefully crafted explanations were being questioned by uncomfortable logic. What would you suggest instead? Catherine had spent the rest of Monday evening drafting alternative explanations that attempted to bridge the gap between constitutional accuracy and public understanding. The work was harder than she had expected, requiring her to research royal history and succession law while trying to maintain the perspective of someone who didn't have that specialized knowledge. Tuesday's agenda included reviewing those alternative drafts with the full team, followed by a session focused on anticipating public questions and developing responses that would be useful for media interviews. Catherine had also been asked to prepare feedback on the visual materials that would accompany the announcement, including graphics designed to explain how the succession would change. Dr. Conway arrived at 8:30 with coffee and a stack of newspapers that she had marked with sections highlighting recent coverage of royal family activities. I thought you might find it useful to see how the media has been discussing succession issues lately, she said, settling into the chair across from Catherine's desk. Catherine studied the marked articles, noting that there had been considerable speculation about changes to the monarchy, though none of the coverage came close to anticipating what would actually be announced on Friday. The speculation focused on modernization efforts, changing public roles, and generational transitions, but nothing suggested that journalists had any advance knowledge of the decision that was about to be made public. Has there been any leaking? Catherine asked. Any signs that the secret is getting out? Dr. Conway shook her head. The circle of people with advance knowledge is very small, and everyone understands the importance of maintaining confidentiality until Friday. But we're monitoring media and social media closely for any signs of premature disclosure. At 9 o'clock, the full team assembled for the day's primary review session. Catherine's alternative drafts were displayed on the large screen while James Mitchell read through her suggestions for clearer language and better organization of the explanatory materials. Ms. Williams has identified several areas where our approach assumes knowledge that the public may not have, Mitchell announced to the group. Her revisions focus on building understanding step by step rather than presenting conclusions without sufficient background. Catherine felt nervous as the team reviewed her work, aware that she was essentially critiquing materials that had been developed by people with far more experience in government communications than she possessed. But, as the discussion proceeded, it became clear that her outsider perspective was identifying genuine problems that the team's expertise hadn't recognized. Margaret Thornley, who had become something like Catherine's advocate within the group, pointed out that several of Catherine's suggested changes addressed questions that had emerged during their focus group sessions with citizens who had been asked to review royal communication materials without being told about the specific announcement being planned. The confusion about what renouncing succession rights actually means was the most common issue in our focus groups, Margaret said. Catherine's revisions directly address that confusion by explaining the practical implications before introducing the formal terminology. The session continued through the morning with detailed review of every element of the announcement package. Catherine found herself becoming more confident in offering suggestions, particularly when her questions revealed assumptions that the team had made about public knowledge that weren't necessarily accurate. The most challenging discussion involved the visual materials designed to illustrate how the line of succession would change. The graphics had been created by specialists in constitutional law and royal protocols, and they were accurate but complex. Catherine's feedback was that they would be confusing rather than clarifying for most viewers. The problem, Catherine explained, is that you're showing the change without explaining why it matters. People need to understand not just what's changing, but how that change affects them and the country. Right now, these graphics look like family tree revisions rather than explanations of constitutional significance. Dr. Conway nodded thoughtfully. What would you suggest instead? Catherine had prepared for this question by sketching out alternative approaches that focused on practical implications rather than technical details. Her suggestions emphasized explaining what the change meant for the monarchy's future rather than documenting the precise legal mechanics of succession modification. Instead of starting with the succession chart, Catherine said, what if we start with explaining why this decision serves the public interest? Then, people understand the reasoning before they try to follow the technical changes. The afternoon session focused on developing responses to anticipated public questions, an exercise that revealed how differently the team's experts thought about the announcement compared to how ordinary citizens would likely react. Catherine's role was to identify questions that the experts weren't considering because they were too close to the subject matter. One question that's going to come up immediately, Catherine said, is whether this decision was made because of pressure or problems that the public doesn't know about. People are going to wonder whether this is really a voluntary choice or whether something forced this decision. James Mitchell frowned. The announcement clearly states that this is a decision made to better serve the public interest. But, people are going to want to know what that actually means, Catherine replied. Saying something serves the public interest doesn't explain why the previous arrangement wasn't serving the public interest. It sounds like there's information being withheld. The discussion that followed was intense, involving constitutional experts, media specialists, and government communications professionals debating how much detail to provide about the reasoning behind the decision. Catherine's perspective was that the public would need enough information to understand and accept the choice, while the experts were concerned about providing too much detail about private royal deliberations. Dr. Conway eventually suggested a compromise approach that would provide general explanations about changing public service opportunities without revealing specific private considerations that had influenced the decision. Catherine was asked to review draft responses based on this approach to assess whether they would satisfy public curiosity without creating new questions. Wednesday morning brought a new challenge in the form of international coordination requirements. Catherine learned that the announcement would need to be communicated simultaneously to Commonwealth nations, each of which had different constitutional relationships with the monarchy and different public understanding of royal protocols. The explanation that works for British audiences might not work for Australian or Canadian audiences, explained Patricia Wells, the international communications coordinator who had joined the team for the day's session. We need approaches that will be clear and appropriate across different constitutional contexts. Catherine found herself trying to understand not just British public reactions, but how citizens of other Commonwealth nations would interpret news about changes to a monarchy that affected their countries but originated in decisions made in London. The complexity was overwhelming, and she began to appreciate why the announcement required such extensive advance planning. The international coordination session revealed that Catherine's role would extend beyond British media and public reaction. Her feedback on explanatory materials would be used to develop communication strategies for multiple countries, each with different media landscapes and different levels of public engagement with royal matters. Wednesday afternoon was devoted to rehearsal sessions for the media interviews that would immediately follow Friday's announcement. Catherine watched Dr. Conway, James Mitchell, and several other team members practice responding to anticipated questions, using the talking points and explanatory frameworks that had been refined throughout the week. Her job during these rehearsals was to play the role of skeptical interviewer, asking questions that might not occur to journalists who regularly covered royal affairs but would be obvious to ordinary citizens hearing the news for the first time. The exercise was revealing, showing how easily expert explanations could sound evasive or incomplete when subjected to straightforward questions about practical implications. When you say this decision will allow for more effective public service, Catherine said during one rehearsal, that sounds like you're saying the current arrangement wasn't effective. Are you criticizing the monarchy? Dr. Conway paused, clearly recognizing that her prepared response didn't adequately address the implication Catherine had identified. That's exactly the kind of question we need to be ready for, she said. We're not criticizing existing arrangements, but we need to explain how this change creates new opportunities without suggesting that previous arrangements were inadequate. By Wednesday evening, Catherine felt as though she had learned more about constitutional law, media management, and government communications in 3 days than she had learned about any subject in years. The work was intellectually demanding in ways that photography had never been, requiring her to think constantly about how complex information could be made accessible without being oversimplified. More challenging was the growing realization of the responsibility she carried. The announcement that would be made Friday afternoon would affect millions of people across multiple countries. Her input was directly influencing how that announcement would be understood and received. The decisions being made in their small conference room would shape public reaction to news that would dominate international headlines for weeks or months. Thursday morning arrived with an unexpected complication. Catherine received a phone call from Sarah, her journalist friend, who had become suspicious about Catherine's unavailability for their usual coffee meetings. "I know you're working on something interesting," Sarah said without preamble. "Your schedule has been completely disrupted for a week, and you're being evasive about what you're doing. If you're involved in something newsworthy, I want to know about it." Catherine felt panic rising in her chest. Sarah's journalistic instincts were excellent, and she had clearly noticed patterns in Catherine's behavior that suggested something unusual was happening. The timing couldn't have been worse, with only one day remaining before the announcement. "I'm working on a project with a strict confidentiality agreement," Catherine said, which was true but completely inadequate for someone with Sarah's investigative experience. "What kind of project requires this level of secrecy? You're acting like you're involved in government work." Catherine realized that Sarah's guess was uncomfortably close to accurate, and that continued evasion might actually make her friend more suspicious rather than less. She needed a strategy that would satisfy Sarah's curiosity without revealing anything that could compromise Friday's announcement. "It's a corporate consulting project," Catherine said. "Media strategy work for a client that requires discretion about their business activities. I can't discuss details because of legal agreements, but it's just temporary work that ends this week." Sarah's silence suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she seemed to accept that further questioning would be unproductive. "Fine. But when your mysterious project is finished, I want to hear about whatever you're allowed to discuss." After hanging up, Catherine realized that managing her personal relationships had become another unexpected complication of her involvement in the announcement planning. The secrecy required by her new role was affecting her normal life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Thursday's team session was focused on final preparations and contingency planning for different scenarios of public reaction. Catherine's role was to help assess whether the team's preparation was adequate for the range of responses they might encounter after Friday's announcement. "What if the public reaction is more negative than we're anticipating?" Catherine asked. "What if people interpret this as instability in the monarchy rather than positive change?" James Mitchell had prepared detailed response strategies for various types of negative reaction, but Catherine's questions revealed gaps in their preparation for the possibility that their carefully crafted explanations might not be convincing to significant portions of the public. The day continued with final reviews of all announcement materials, last-minute adjustments to media strategy, and preparation of backup plans for technical or logistical problems that might affect Friday's carefully coordinated release of information. By Thursday evening, Catherine felt as though she had been preparing for the most important test of her life, except that the test would be taken by millions of other people who would judge whether the announcement team had succeeded in making complex constitutional news accessible and acceptable to citizens across multiple countries. As she left the government communications facility Thursday night, Catherine realized that her life had been fundamentally changed by a week of accidentally stumbling into extraordinary circumstances. Tomorrow afternoon, she would find out whether her contributions had helped ensure that historic news would be communicated in ways that served the public interest, or whether she had participated in something that would be remembered as a failure of government communications. The responsibility felt enormous, and Catherine wasn't sure she was ready for whatever Friday would bring. Friday morning arrived with the peculiar quality that Catherine imagined must precede natural disasters. Everything appeared normal while carrying an undercurrent of approaching significance that made ordinary activities feel surreal. She had breakfast in her flat, reading newspapers that contained no hint of the announcement that would dominate their pages by evening, and found herself studying headlines about routine political developments with the strange perspective of someone who knew they would be completely overshadowed within hours. Catherine arrived at the government communications facility at 7 o'clock to find the building already bustling with activity that felt different from the previous week's preparation. The planning phase was over. Today was about execution, monitoring, and response management. The conference room that had served as their planning center had been transformed into what James Mitchell called the Situation Room, equipped with multiple screens displaying news feeds, social media monitoring, and communication networks connecting them to palace officials, government departments, and media organizations. Dr. Conway met Catherine at the building entrance with coffee and a schedule that outlined her role for the day. "We're moving into implementation mode," she explained as they walked to the Situation Room. "Your job today is to monitor public reaction in real time and help us adjust our response strategy based on how people are actually receiving the news." The schedule showed that Catherine would spend the morning in final preparation sessions, observe the announcement at 3 o'clock, and then participate in response assessment meetings that would continue into the evening. Her specific responsibility was to track whether the explanatory materials they had developed were effectively addressing the questions and concerns that emerged as the news spread. By 8:30, the full team had assembled for what Mitchell described as their final briefing before the announcement. The room felt tense with controlled energy, like a theater company preparing for opening night after weeks of rehearsal. Everyone understood their roles, the timing had been coordinated down to the minute, and the success of their efforts would be measured by how effectively the British public and international audiences understood and accepted news that would reshape their understanding of the monarchy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mitchell began, "at 3 o'clock this afternoon, we will implement the most significant royal communication strategy in living memory. The announcement itself will last approximately 4 minutes. Everything we've prepared over the past weeks will be judged on how well it supports public understanding of those 4 minutes." Catherine looked around the room at the faces of people who had spent months planning for this moment. Margaret Thornley was reviewing media contact lists with the precision of someone coordinating a military operation. Dr. Conway was studying final drafts of explanatory materials that would be released immediately after the announcement. Patricia Wells was managing international coordination requirements that span multiple time zones and constitutional frameworks. The morning sessions focused on last-minute technical preparations and rehearsal of response protocols. Catherine's role was to participate in mock scenarios where the team practiced responding to different types of public reaction. She played the part of confused citizen, skeptical journalist, and concerned Commonwealth resident, helping the team refine their responses to questions they might not have anticipated. "What if people think this decision was made because of health problems that aren't being disclosed?" Catherine asked during one scenario. "How do you respond to speculation that this is really about hidden medical issues?" The question prompted a 20-minute discussion about how to address speculation without providing unnecessary details about private health matters. Catherine's perspective was that the public would need enough information to feel confident that they weren't being misled, while the team's experts were concerned about establishing precedents for discussing private royal medical information. By noon, Catherine felt as though she had been preparing for the announcement for months rather than a week. The intensity of the planning process had compressed her learning curve dramatically, transforming her from someone who knew nothing about royal communications into someone who could anticipate public reactions and suggest strategic responses. The lunch break felt surreal. Catherine found herself eating a sandwich in the building's cafeteria, surrounded by civil servants discussing ordinary policy matters, while knowing that the afternoon would bring news that would affect constitutional arrangements across the Commonwealth. The disconnect between the ordinary lunch conversation and the extraordinary afternoon ahead was almost overwhelming. At 2:30, the team assembled in the Situation Room for the final countdown to the announcement. Multiple screens displayed news channels that would carry the announcement live, social media monitoring systems that would track public reaction in real time, and communication networks connecting them to officials who would be implementing related aspects of the announcement strategy. Catherine took her position at a workstation equipped with access to social media feeds, news websites, and public reaction monitoring systems. Her job was to track how ordinary citizens were responding to the news as it spread, identifying patterns of confusion, concern, or acceptance that would guide the team's post-announcement communication strategy. At 2:55, the room fell silent as the main screen displayed the palace setting where the announcement would be made. Catherine felt her heart rate increase as she realized she was about to witness from the inside the moment when information she had accidentally acquired became international news. At exactly 3 o'clock, His Royal Highness appeared on screen and began the announcement that Catherine had helped plan for the past week. The words she heard were refined versions of drafts she had reviewed, explanations she had helped develop, and responses to questions she had helped anticipate. After careful consideration and consultation with Her Majesty and the government, the announcement began: I have decided to renounce my place in the line of succession to pursue other forms of public service that I believe will better serve the national interest and the interests of the Commonwealth. Catherine watched the announcement with the strange perspective of someone who understood both the advanced planning behind every word and the public impact those words would have on people hearing them for the first time. The explanation continued for exactly 4 minutes, covering the reasoning behind the decision, the constitutional implications, and the practical changes that would follow. As soon as the announcement concluded, Catherine's workstation erupted with activity. Social media reactions began appearing immediately, ranging from shock and confusion to speculation about hidden reasons for the decision. News websites started publishing analysis pieces that had clearly been prepared in advance by journalists who had anticipated this possibility. International news outlets began covering the story with varying levels of understanding about British constitutional arrangements. Catherine's job was to sort through the immediate public reaction and identify patterns that would guide the team's response strategy. The task was overwhelming: thousands of social media posts, dozens of news articles, and live television coverage that was attempting to provide context and analysis for audiences across multiple countries. The confusion level is higher than we anticipated, Catherine reported during the first assessment meeting at 3:30. A lot of people are asking whether this means the monarchy is in crisis, and they're not finding our explanatory materials quickly enough to address their immediate concerns. James Mitchell nodded grimly. What specific types of confusion are you seeing? Catherine had prepared a summary of the most common questions and concerns emerging from her monitoring. People want to know whether this decision was voluntary or whether there were problems that forced it. They want to understand how this affects the monarchy's stability. And there's a lot of speculation about whether other royal family members knew about this in advance. The discussion that followed was rapid and intense, with team members proposing adjustments to their response strategy based on the patterns Catherine was identifying. Dr. Conway suggested releasing additional explanatory materials that directly addressed the questions about voluntary versus forced decision-making. Margaret Thornley recommended expediting the media interviews that had been planned for later in the afternoon. Patricia Wells, monitoring international reactions, reported that Commonwealth countries were responding differently based on their varying constitutional relationships with the monarchy. Australia and Canada are focusing on what this means for their own governmental arrangements, she said. We need to provide clearer guidance about how this change affects different constitutional frameworks. Catherine spent the rest of the afternoon tracking the evolution of public reaction as news coverage became more detailed and explanatory materials began reaching wider audiences. The pattern she observed was initially chaotic response giving way to more informed discussion as people found access to the background information the team had prepared. By 5 o'clock, Catherine was able to report that the confusion level was decreasing as the team's explanatory strategy took effect. The questions are becoming more sophisticated, she told the assessment meeting. People are moving from "what does this mean" to "why was this the right decision?" That suggests they're understanding the basic facts and are ready for more detailed explanations about the reasoning. The evening continued with monitoring sessions, strategy adjustments, and coordination with media outlets that were providing ongoing coverage of the announcement and its implications. Catherine found herself playing an essential role in helping the team understand whether their communication strategy was achieving its intended effect of promoting public understanding and acceptance. By 8 o'clock, preliminary polling data began arriving that would provide more systematic assessment of public reaction. Catherine reviewed the early results with fascination, seeing quantified evidence of how effectively the announcement had been communicated to different demographic groups and geographic regions. The acceptance level is higher than our most optimistic projections, Dr. Conway reported to the full team. 67% of respondents indicate that they understand the reasoning behind the decision, and 59% agree that it serves the public interest. Catherine felt a surge of satisfaction that was entirely new to her professional experience. The work she had done over the past week had directly contributed to ensuring that millions of people understood and accepted news that could have been disruptive and confusing if it had been communicated less effectively. The day concluded with a debriefing session where the team reviewed what had worked well and what could be improved for future royal communication challenges. Catherine's role was acknowledged as having been crucial in ensuring that the announcement strategy addressed public concerns rather than just institutional requirements. Miss Williams, James Mitchell said as the session concluded, "Your contribution has been invaluable. We couldn't have achieved this level of public understanding without your perspective on how our explanations would be received by ordinary citizens." As Catherine prepared to leave the government communications facility for the last time, Dr. Conway approached her with a proposal that suggested her accidental introduction to royal communications might lead to more permanent involvement. "We've been impressed with your work this week," Dr. Conway said. "There's a possibility of ongoing consulting opportunities if you're interested in continuing this type of work. Royal communications is a specialized field, and we could use someone with your ability to bridge the gap between institutional expertise and public understanding." Catherine realized that her life had been permanently changed by the week's experiences. She had discovered skills and interests she hadn't known she possessed, and she had contributed to something far more significant than any corporate photography assignment could ever be. The possibility of continuing this work was both exciting and daunting. Walking home through London that Friday evening, Catherine found herself looking at newspapers' headlines about the announcement she had helped plan, listening to radio discussions about implications she had helped anticipate, and observing public conversations about news she had helped communicate effectively. Her accidental overhearing of a palace conversation had led to her playing a role in one of the most successful royal communication operations in modern history. The extraordinary week had begun with Catherine Williams as an unknown freelance photographer who had stumbled into something far beyond her experience. It ended with her as someone who had contributed to ensuring that historic constitutional news was communicated in ways that served the public interest and promoted democratic understanding of monarchical change. As she reached her flat, Catherine realized that she would never again be able to read news about royal announcements or government communications without understanding the complex planning and careful consideration that went into making major news accessible and acceptable to citizens across diverse audiences. Her perspective on how democracy and monarchy intersected in modern Britain had been permanently and profoundly changed. The palace update had been confirmed, fans hadn't had to wait long for the big reveal, and Catherine Williams had played an essential role in ensuring that when the revelation came, it served everyone's interests as effectively as possible. Her accidental journey from wedding photographer to royal communications consultant was complete, and the possibilities for what might come next were as extraordinary as anything she could have imagined when she first walked through the gates of Kensington Palace just 1 week earlier.